Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my little fight review and my final fight breakdown of the Jaron Ennis versus Stanionis fight, of course, that ended up happening. And unfortunately, I could not do this a little bit earlier. I also had to watch that of the UFC main event tonight. The fights of tonight, which, of course, pretty great card. I might even talk about the Volkanovski versus Diego Lopez fight, but we'll see about that. But anyways, of course, for those of you that did not end up hearing about the fight pretty much went down as I had predicted, but a little bit different, of course, because not only did a stoppage happen within this fight, but it happened pretty early, at least right after the sixth round. Mr. Stanionis, of course, could not go on any further, and Jaron Ennis, of course, was able to win this fight, I believe, by a technical stoppage. So is what it is. But anyways, this fight pretty much ended up going down exactly how I thought that it was going to go. And pretty much every factor that I thought was going to be a factor within this fight was a factor. I thought that the fact that Stanionis, the fact that he had a very high guard, mostly throughout his fights, I thought that that was going to be a factor. And Stanionis, he's a guy that is very good for what he does, but he pretty much can only fight good in one way. What he really wants you to do is that he wants you to stay within range or be trapped up against the ropes, and he's gonna wait for you to throw certain shots for it to land on his high guard or on his elbows or on his arms, and then he's going to return within those exchanges with hooks or whatever he might throw, a jab or a right hand, and then he might be able to land that way. But if you're able to get out of his range and if you're able to move around him and use lateral movement and really have that stabbing jab to the body early on, which is everything that Jaron Ennis did within this fight, then you're going to be able to beat him. And that's pretty much what I had predicted. And what I stated is that Jaron Ennis, in order to win this fight, he was going to have to get that stabbing jab to the body very early on, which is exactly what he did. Jaron Ennis, of course, did a very good job. He was using great foot movement. He was using great lateral movement. The only thing that I will state about Jaron Ennis is this: he's not always the greatest defensive fighter. Sometimes he gets a little bit, too bloodthirsty for, damaging his opponent, or sometimes he can get a little bit too thirsty for the knockout. He's going to have to be very careful with that. Because even though, this dude right here, the Lithuanian fighter Stanionis, I believe, he's not a guy that can probably take as much advantage of that. But if you face a fighter, that's going to be a problem because you might get hit with the wrong type of fighter one day. And many people, when they take a look at a fighter like a Jaron Ennis, or I mean, really, to be quite honest with you, when they take a look at a fighter, period, they take a look at their lineage or their background, whether they be a black fighter or a Mexican fighter or a Caucasian fighter, and they just immediately assume certain things about them because of the past. And of course, sometimes that's appropriate as a comparison because, of course, there are certain fighters that, of course, have similar characteristics from where they're from. When you talk about Mexican fighters, even though they have great heart and they're great, technical fighters, sometimes they can be a bit flat footed or not have the best amount of head movement. When you talk about European fighters, they can be a little bit stiff and not have the best of head movement. When you talk about that of Black American fighters, of course, they can have, very slick movement, at times be very defensively responsible, have very good and quick feet. But that's not always the case. Now, Jaron Ennis, I think, is mainly, good in, most categories. But what I will state is that he's not a quote unquote defensive master. Many people, when they take a look, at certain fighters, once again, they just appropriate them with fighters of the past, which really diminishes and waters down the talents, that those particular fighters were, like that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Penelope P. Whitaker. Now, Jaron Ennis is more talented than them in maybe certain areas such as power or something like that, but he's not the defensive master that those fighters were. He's just not. And I wanted to state that very quickly because many people, especially from America, they take a look at Jaron Ennis and they immediately think that these guys are defensive masters, and they're not. It's very similar with that of a Terrence Bud Crawford. Now, they're not bad defensively, but they're not a Floyd. They're also not that of a Penelope P. Whitaker. I don't say this in order to tear them down, but I do state this, that there is certain things that they may need to sharpen up. Every fighter to a degree has something that they can probably work on and sharpen up. And really the only major flaw that I see in Jaron Boots' style is that sometimes he stays within the range a little bit too long, or he'll keep both hands down. He just allows his opponent sometimes to get too many hits off, especially inside the range. And usually what that's a sign of is that they're a little bit too bloodthirsty to hurt or knock out their opponent. And there are just certain fighters that are like that. We've seen a very similar thing with David Benavidez in certain fights, where sometimes the combination will be a little bit too long, or he'll really be putting it on his opponent, and then he'll get hit with something, and either he's been knocked down, or it has put him a little bit in trouble, whether it be against David Morrell, or also I believe against that one fighter that was a part of Mayweather's gym that knocked him down with the right cross early on. You got to be very careful. You got to get in and outside of the range. Now, the question will be about Mr. Jaron Ennis is that will he finally find an opponent that will cause him to be the most defensively responsible that he's ever been? Because even though, of course, this dude right here was clearly the biggest fight of Jaron Ennis' career, I think that once Jaron Ennis got in the ring, he knew that there wasn't going to be much that Mr. Stanionis was going to be able to do. And I pretty much predicted that because for anyone that has watched both of these fighters, it was very clear who the more multidimensional fighter was. Stanionis, however you pronounce his name, he's a very good fighter, but he pretty much can only fight great in one way. What he really wants you to do is that he's going to try to pressure you. He's going to try to get in on you, maybe change levels to a certain degree, kind of work off that jab. But he's going to have a high guard throughout the whole entire fight, which is good to a degree. But you have to be a little bit more maneuverable and a little bit more loose with it. You can't just have a high guard the whole entire time because it's going to make you a bit stiffer. And then on top of that, it's going to blind you to certain attacks and certain punches, which is why Jaron Ennis is able to hide certain attacks with that of the jab or slip the right hand right through the guard. So the high guard is a great thing. Keeping your hands up is a great thing. But sometimes you also need to keep it away from your eyesight or from your face at certain times, at least, be a little bit more fluid with it, be a little bit more fluid with your movement, and not always, once again, just have it up the whole entire time to that high guard to the point to where it's going to blind you and it's going to make you a little bit more stiff. You need to hold it up at the appropriate times. And Stanionis is just one of those fighters to where, once again, he's a guy that comes in with the high guard, and he's going to wait for you to land on his arms or his shoulders or, his biceps or something like that, crunch down. And then he's going to try to land, his whopping hooks on you, or maybe a good overhand right or an uppercut, something like that. And I stated what was going to happen if Jaron Ennis was going to use his footwork and his lateral movement, and on top of that, his 6-inch reach advantage. And if he stabs that body, it's that jab to the body. And pretty much what ended up happening is exactly what I had predicted. He had completely outboxed him, and of course, he had completely demolished him. And eventually, it was to the point to where Stanionis, of course, he, had to quit in the corner after the 6th round. Now, I'm not really quite sure if he quit or if his corner made him quit or whatever it was, but I really don't blame him that much because he was getting his ass kicked anyway. There was no way in my view that he was going to win the fight, and if you want your fighter to have more of a profitable career, of course you want them to be, in fights later on, which is of course exactly why Mark Breland ended up stopping the fight with that of a Deontay Wilder. But Wilder, of course, and boxers, they don't really understand that perspective. They just get embarrassed and say, why did you do that? I could have possibly won the fight, or, now you kind of make me, look stupid, or, you make me look like I was scared or something, or that I was completely getting my ass kicked. Which, of course, in most situations they are. But, of course, a fighter has a completely different type of mindset. But, very great performance on that of a Jaron Ennis. He has shown that he's a great multi-dimensional fighter, and I definitely think that he is a future top 10 pound-for-pound talent. Now, that being stated, because certain people I did see discuss should Jaron Ennis be on the top 10 pound-for-pound list. I'm not going to go as far to state that he should be on the top 10 pound-for-pound list because right now, in my personal view, there are just too many fighters that have accomplishments or have a better resume than him. I think that when you talk about, of course, guys like Usyk and Inoue and Crawford and, also guys like Canelo and Bivol, I think that that's really not even a conversation that needs to be had. But then you even have guys like Shakur Stevenson and, Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez and maybe some other guys that I'm not thinking of, maybe Haney or Teofimo Lopez or some of those guys if you want to count them. But the thing is with Jaron Ennis is that he definitely is on his way. But the thing is that without a confirmed level, A-grade level win, and with him only winning in one weight class, especially with 2 belts, I don't think right now that at least definitively I can say that he's in my top 10 pound for pound. And of course, one of those fighters that I would also state is debatably in the top 10 is Gervonta Tank Davis and maybe a couple of other ones. But he would definitely probably be within my top 20 to top 25. If he were to beat Virgil Ortiz next or, beat Madrimov and then Virgil Ortiz next, he definitely would have a great argument for being in the bottom 5 of my top 10 pound for pound, if you want to talk about that, but we'll see what ends up happening there. But this dude is very, very talented. The only thing that I would state is that he's going to have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes he gets a little bit too thirsty for the knockout. And if he goes in against the wrong guy, he is going to get hit, and he's got to be very careful. He looks like he has a very great beard, and then he has a very great chin, of course, which is what I mean by stating that, but he's got to be very careful. You know what I mean? So we'll see what ends up happening. He's a very great fighter, but we'll see how it happens when he steps up the level in competition. It would be very interesting to see him in a fight, maybe against Virgil Ortiz or Madrimov or some of those guys at 154. Now, I don't think that there's really a whole lot of A-grade level fighters other than Virgil Ortiz or maybe Madrimov at 154. And that's even a guess that Madrimov is an A- level fighter because, to be honest with you, the two biggest fights of his career he's lost. But, I mean, it is what it is. At least he made it competitive. But, I mean, we'll see what ends up happening later on down the line. And, of course, how could I forget Sebastian Fundora and maybe even Errol Spence making a little bit of a fight with Jaron Ennis if Errol Spence is somehow able to come back. But we'll see what ends up happening. I'm going to be very interested to see who he fights next. I also don't know much about Brian Norman Jr. I've heard about him. He's also one of the champions there. And I believe that he also is another American fighter. So that would be a very interesting fight. Very interesting fight. I wonder how, similarly they are in style, but I'd have to see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Congratulations to Mr. Jaron Ennis for putting on a phenomenal performance. But that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. And of course, we'll see what happens next. I predict that more than likely he's going to try to get the fight either against Brian Norman Jr. or Mario Barrios next, because Jaron Ennis has stated multiple times that he wants to fight at the welterweight division until, of course, he unifies all the belts. So we'll see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.